There was a time when the known world believed it was safe. But in the year 597 BC, that world collapsed. Jerusalem was invaded, the temple was desecrated, the people taken into exile, and the covenant shattered. And in the midst of that deep silence, one man began to see what no one else could see. He wasn't a king. He wasn't a general. He was a priest, and God chose him as his messenger. His name was Ezekiel. What his eyes saw defies all human logic. Wheels within wheels, winged beings with many faces, storms of fire spinning upon themselves, a throne suspended between the heavens. Ezekiel didn't have a vision. He had an encounter with the impossible. But that revelation did not come to bring hope. It came to announce a judgment. First, Ezekiel prophesied the fall of his own people. He foretold the destruction of Jerusalem. But then came something darker, greater, more final. God began to speak, not just to Judah, but to the entire world. One by one, the nations were sentenced. Ammon, Moab, Edom, Philistia, Tyre, Sidon, Egypt. There were no warnings, no redemption, only oracles, divine decrees of total destruction. God didn't just judge his people. God sentenced the world. This is not a theological study, not a simple religious reflection. This video is a deep exploration into the most feared and silenced chapters of the Old Testament. Here you'll discover 5 perspectives, 5 ways to interpret the judgments of Ezekiel, 5 theories that challenge religion, history, and modern conscience. Because maybe what Ezekiel saw was not just the end of an era, but the first act of a judgment that has not yet ended. Divine global judgment. And then, the judgment was no longer just an internal matter. It was no longer just about Jerusalem, nor about a rebellious people. What began as a prophecy directed at a chosen nation became something much greater, much darker, and far more universal. God turned against the nations. Ammon, Moab, Edom, Philistia, Tyre, Sidon, Egypt. 7 names, 7 ancient kingdoms that truly existed. 7 oracles spoken with chilling clarity. These were not generic messages, not abstract symbols. They were specific sentences delivered with surgical precision. Each nation was judged for a different reason, and each reason speaks more about the human heart than ancient politics. Ammon, for example, mocked the fall of Jerusalem. They celebrated it, applauded it, and for that mockery, they were condemned to oblivion. God said, "I will hand you over to the peoples of the east. You will be food for animals. You will never be remembered again." Exaggerated punishment, or a lesson about rejoicing in the misfortune of others? Moab, on the other hand, fell into a subtler sin, spiritual contempt. They claimed Judah was no different from any other nation. They denied its holiness. They minimized the divine. And for that, they too were erased. Edom was judged for treachery. They took advantage of Judah's weakness to stab them in the back. And God didn't forget. He promised to pour out blood upon their land until the name of Edom would vanish. Curious fact, today there is no living city bearing the original name of Edom. It vanished as a people, as a culture, and as a memory. Philistia, Israel's eternal enemy, was sentenced for ancestral hatred. A hatred passed from generation to generation, and the prophecy was clear. I will destroy the Kerethites and wipe out the remnant along the coast. Today, ancient Philistia is completely dissolved, its descendants absorbed by empires, its gods forgotten. Tyre was perhaps the most powerful, a commercial empire, a city built on islands, believed to be invincible. But it fell because of its arrogance, for saying, "I am a god, I sit on the throne of gods." Ezekiel not only prophesied its fall, He described exactly how it would happen, wave after wave of attack. First Babylon, then Alexander the Great, and finally, the sea consumed it. Today, ancient Tyre lies underwater, exactly as Ezekiel foretold. Sidon, Tyre's neighbors, was accused of idolatry, and the prophecy was direct. I will send a plague into you, and blood will fill your streets. The wounded will fall within you by the sword. What's interesting is that archaeologists have confirmed that Sidon experienced violent uprisings, epidemics, and one of the earliest forms of biological warfare when Alexander the Great poisoned its wells. And finally, Egypt, the giant, the cradle of kings and gods, the ultimate symbol of human power. Egypt was condemned for a very different reason, its silent pride. God said, "Because you said, 'The Nile is mine, I made it. I will spread my nets over you, and your land will be desolate for 40 years. And it happened. Egypt was invaded, humiliated, plundered, and it never returned to its former glory. Coincidence? Poetic justice? Or precise prophetic fulfillment? Because what's truly impressive is not just that the nations were judged, but that the judgment was fulfilled. Every word, every sentence, every fall. God revealed himself as the ultimate sovereign, not just over Israel, but over history, over nations, over the earth. And now comes the uncomfortable reflection. If God judged entire nations for their pride, their mockery, or their arrogance, what makes us think he wouldn't do the same today? Do we really believe modern empires are exempt? That today's powers aren't repeating the same sins? Mockery of the sacred, treachery disguised as strategy, commercial pride, hatred masked as power. Nothing has changed, only the names. And what makes this perspective even more disturbing is what comes next. Because not all judgments were logical, not all punishments made human sense. Some seemed driven by a deeper rage, more visceral, more dark. And it's here where one of the most dangerous questions of the Old Testament arises. Was this divine justice or revenge? Because the line is very thin. Justice or divine vengeance. But when you look more closely, something begins to feel unsettling. Ezekiel's oracles don't sound like balanced justice. They don't read like the words of a serene judge. They seem written by someone wounded, hurt, furious. Divine justice starts to feel more visceral, more human, more bloody. And this is where the dangerous question is born, the one that divides theologians, challenges sermons, and shakes consciences. Can God be just and at the same time vengeful? Because in chapters 25 to 32, the language is no longer symbolic. It is brutal. I will wipe you off the map. I will cast you down to Sheol. You will be a horror and never be remembered again. Words that leave no room for redemption, no offer of forgiveness, no warning, only punishment. And the most disturbing part is that some of these punishments seem disproportionate. Ammon, for instance, was sentenced for mocking, just that. They didn't kill, invade, or enslave. They mocked the fall of Jerusalem, and for that, they received a sentence of total extermination. Ezekiel 25 makes it clear. I will make Rabbah a pasture for camels and the Ammonites, a place of eternal ruin. Justice or an emotional reaction? And this is not an isolated case. Moab was condemned for saying, Judah is like all other nations, a comment, a sentence. But to God, it was enough to promise complete devastation. There's something here that forces us to pause. Are we witnessing a heavenly judge or a wounded deity? And if the punishment is not only for the act, but for the attitude, aren't we then dealing with a God who demands absolute reverence under threat of annihilation? At this point in the book, the image of God transforms. He's no longer just the Lord of hosts. He becomes devouring fire, an unstoppable storm, a sacred will with no room for mercy. And that is unsettling, even for the most faithful scholars. Theologians like Walter Brueggemann and John Levinson have written that Ezekiel's judgments are the most intense, violent, and absolute in the entire prophetic canon. There is no offer of repentance, no path back, only downfall and eternal silence. An interesting fact, in the ancient world, the worst punishment was not death, it was oblivion, to die unremembered, to be erased from time, from history, from existence. And that is precisely what God promises here. You will be eternal. Oblivion, you will no longer exist. A punishment not just physical, but existential. This is not about killing a body. It's about extinguishing a legacy. Can a God of love speak those words? Maybe yes. Maybe perfect love demands perfect justice. Maybe divine judgment operates on a logic we can't understand. But you could better what if it doesn't? What if what we are seeing in these texts is not the justice of God, but his limit? What if we are facing a moment where the divine comes face to face with its own threshold of patience? What if this is not a vengeful God, but a God who, like any living being, can reach a breaking point? And then another clue appears, one that forces us to look towards the present. For centuries, entire civilizations have risen in the name of ideologies, of power, of ambition. Kingdoms that despised the sacred, trampled peoples, celebrated their strength, and then vanished without a trace. Could we be witnessing, even today, modern variations of these ancient judgments? And what if this pattern repeats cyclically, not as automatic punishment, but as a spiritual inevitability, as if the earth itself cannot tolerate unchecked arrogance, as if the divine, in silence, is only waiting for the moment to settle the account. But just when we think we've reached the depths of judgment, a stranger figure appears, a king who claims to have been in Eden, a perfect being who fell through pride. And suddenly the prophecy stops speaking of men and begins to touch the threshold of the celestial, because the next oracle no longer seems directed at an ordinary king. It feels like an echo of a much older rebellion, the king of Tyre, a shadow of Lucifer. But then, something changes. Ezekiel's voice, until now directed at nations and peoples, suddenly focuses on a single figure, a man, a king. It is the king of Tyre. At first, it sounds like just another political judgment, another condemnation for pride and corruption. But as the speech unfolds, the tone shifts, the words rise, and the text begins to speak a different language, one that no longer feels earthly. You were in Eden, the garden of God. Every precious stone adorned you. You were an anointed guardian cherub placed on the holy mount of God. You were perfect in all your ways until iniquity was found in you. Who is Ezekiel speaking to? A Phoenician king? Or someone far more ancient? Many theologians, even from the early centuries of Christianity, have affirmed that this passage cannot be about a mere human. The references to Eden, to the cherub, to the holy mountain, go far beyond political categories. This is one of the most frequently cited texts when discussing the fall of Lucifer, because while the language is symbolic, it is too precise to ignore. Historical curiosity. The Mount of God mentioned here also appears in Isaiah 14, where another prophet speaks of a being who sought to rise above the stars of God, to set his throne beside the Most High, and was then cast into the abyss. Coincidence? Or two prophets across different eras speaking of the same being? Let's return to Tyre. Tyre was a magnificent city, a maritime fortress built on islands, wealthy, influential, powerful. It dominated international trade and worshipped pagan gods like Baal and Astarte. Its king saw himself as untouchable, divine, eternal, and Ezekiel throws him a phrase like a burning spear. You said, I am a god, but you are just a man. Here, the judgment ceases to be political. It becomes a spiritual act, a direct confrontation between divine sovereignty and human arrogance. But the message goes further. The description of the king of Tyre becomes a prophetic mirror, a reflection of the first rebellion, the oldest and the most absolute. What if Ezekiel is speaking on two levels at once? The historical king of Tyre, and the archetype of every being who ever believed they could be equal to God. A being who stood in Eden, perfect, a guardian cherub, a bearer of glory, but who was consumed by pride and fell. Powerful theological insight. In systematic theology, this passage has long been interpreted as a dual revelation, a condemnation of a man, and a coded unveiling of the first rebel in heaven. Even St. Jerome, in the 4th century, affirmed that Ezekiel 28 was key to understanding the fall of Satan. And here comes an observation we cannot ignore. The sin described in Ezekiel 28 is identical to Lucifer's: pride, self-idolatry, desire to usurp the divine throne, inevitable fall. Is this the spiritual portrait of Lucifer, hidden within the judgment of a king? And if so, what if this judgment isn't just history, but a spiritual mirror? What if every leader who has seen themselves as divine, every empire that has placed its throne above good and evil, every ideology that has displaced God, is repeating this same scene? You were perfect until iniquity was found in you. What if this judgment hasn't ended, but continues to echo again and again? Because what comes next is even more symbolic, more structured, and much more personal. God will now address the greatest power of the ancient world, Egypt, the empire of empires, and what he speaks is not an attack. It is a spiritual surgery, a silent and humiliating deconstruction of human power. A warning for the present? But what if all of this isn't just history? What if these judgments weren't merely punishments of the past, but living prophetic patterns, active, cyclical, repeatable? Because if one thing becomes clear when reading these chapters of Ezekiel, it's that the reasons God judged those ancient nations have not disappeared. They've only changed language, flag, uniform, pride, betrayal, mockery, injustice, idolatry. These aren't ancient concepts. They are global realities. Aren't we still witnessing empires that mock the faith? Systems that oppress instead of protect? Powers that betray sacred alliances for convenience and worship money, power, image, as if they were new gods? How far are we really? From Ammon? From Moab? From Egypt? The Bible doesn't portray God as an impulsive judge, but as one who watches, who listens, who records, and when the time is fulfilled, he acts. Prophetic insight. In ancient times, prophets spoke to their era, but they also planted echoes meant to travel across generations. Many scholars believe Ezekiel's oracles are not just reactions to past events, but prophetic codes, waiting to activate whenever the human heart repeats the same sins. In other words, these texts are not dead. They are waiting to be repeated. And that's where the message becomes uncomfortable, because the conditions for divine judgment haven't changed, but the characters have. Today, they're not ancient kingdoms. They are corporations, governments, ideologies, systems, and hearts. What if we are, unknowingly, living inside a new chapter of Ezekiel? What if the judgments of the past were merely dress rehearsals for a far greater global reckoning that approaches? Not because the world is weak, but because it has provoked the heavens. Empires don't fall because of their economy. They fall because of their arrogance. Geopolitical curiosity. Over the past 100 years, more than 70 empires, powers, or political regimes have collapsed. Some in mere days, others over a few decades. Some fell through war, others through moral implosion, almost all because they didn't see the inevitable coming. And in nearly every case, there are elements that resonate with the judgments of Ezekiel. Rejoicing in the downfall of others. Blind trust in wealth or technology. Modern idolatry, public figures, ideologies, symbols. Betrayal of sacred covenants. Contempt for the divine. What if the judgment of nations is a spiritual cycle? A law written into the fabric of existence that does not tolerate repetition. Ezekiel wasn't just witnessing the collapse of his world. He was leaving behind a map for ours. A map that screams, this isn't ancient history. This is about you, about me, about us, now. Because after the judgment, when it seems like everything has been destroyed, comes something even more mysterious. A vision that feels like a nightmare, or like the impossible promise of resurrection. Bones, dead, dry, scattered across a valley. And a voice that asks, can these bones live? What follows is not mere restoration. It's something stranger. A prophecy of return, of reconstruction, of collective resurrection. But is it a promise of hope, or the beginning of a new mystery? One that hides something even darker. And when nothing remains, when the cities have been destroyed, the empires humiliated, the names erased, Ezekiel sees something else, something that makes no sense, something that shouldn't exist. A valley, long, silent, filled with human remains, an open graveyard, no tombs, no crosses, just bones, dry, white, forgotten. And then a voice interrupts. Son of man, can these bones live? The scene is brutal, almost pulled from a post-apocalyptic nightmare. But it's more than a vision. It's an existential question, a spiritual provocation, a prophetic dilemma. Because what Ezekiel is seeing is not just death. It's the possibility of a rebirth that doesn't feel natural. A hope or a spiritual experiment? Many interpret this vision as the restoration of Israel, others as a symbolic resurrection of the human spirit. But some see something more disturbing. What if what's coming back to life isn't what was once holy, but what was once useful? What if the rebirth isn't complete, but forced, programmed, cold, empty? What kind of life can be born after total judgment? Will it be the same humanity or something completely different? This next episode won't be a celebration. It will be a spiritual autopsy, a deep exploration of what happens when God himself breathes life into what should no longer exist. If this journey made you think, if something inside you stirred with every word, don't stop now. This video is part of a prophetic and spiritual series on Ezekiel that you should not watch in fragments to understand the full impact of this message. We've linked some videos in the description that will make you question everything. Subscribe, turn on notifications, share this video if you feel this message needs to be heard. Because we're not creating content, we're unearthing visions, and this has only just begun.